Hello and welcome to my intensive. This is Contact in the Desert, and I'm going to talk right now about the jaw sign and the proof that the jaw sign, in fact, was an opener or a key to get into the real Hall of Records. If you have a sealed chamber, a sealed room of records, a Hall of Records, as Edgar Cayce called it, then there must be a way to open it up again. And this is part of the crucial evidence that I present in my book Under the Sphinx, namely that the inscriptions that I found show not only a lioness statue that was guarding this archive, but it also was an archive that was accessible with a device, and that device is shown above the lioness. In a paper that we published in 2017, Robert Schoch, Robert Bouval, and I dedicated this sign, this symbol, to the memory of John Anthony West. And of course, John Anthony West was still alive at the time, and so we wanted to honor him for his work revolving around the Great Sphinx and about the history of ancient Egypt. And regrettably, John Anthony West actually passed away a couple of years ago. And so I think this is a fitting memorial also to him, that we have a symbol that is so intimately tied to his work on the Great Sphinx. And so this is now what I want to talk about tonight. I will summarize briefly what I mentioned in my main talk, which is the jaw sign itself, where do we see it, and why do I think that that symbol that we see hovering above the lioness is an opener or a key and not something else. And then what I want to do is show you some more proof, some in writing, in the hieroglyphic writing of the ancient Egyptians, that there was in fact a physical archive in Giza, and this is the same archive that we see guarded by the lioness Mehit, and that archive could be opened with the opener, with this device that's hovering above her back. And here is an example of a real object that may have given rise to a symbol that we call the jaw sign. This is just a piece of copper that I bend into the shape of the jaw sign to get a better feel for what the object may have been used for. Here is the dedication to the memory of John Anthony West. This comes from a publication that Robert Schoch, Robert Bouval, and I published in 2017 about Mehit, about the jaw sign, and about a possible real Hall of Records at Giza. And at the end of the paper, we wrote this dedication. And because this symbol really had not been classified properly, and it was not even a hieroglyphic symbol, and therefore there was no translation of it, and it had not been given a name, we decided to give it a name and dedicate it to the memory of John Anthony West. And this is the lioness that is associated with this symbol, with the jaw sign, in several inscriptions. Her name was Mehit, spelled in hieroglyphic immediately above her in this particular inscription that comes from the stone plate of Wepemnofret. So how was the lioness Mehit with the jaw sign used? Well, it turns out that these two symbols were part of a title sequence that was conferred only to very special people, very high officials at the court of the king. And this title disappeared by the fourth dynasty, so approximately 4,500 years ago. It really only was in existence for about 5 centuries. And here we have an example that comes from the early dynastic phase. We see the lioness with the jaw sign above. And here you kind of get a feel for the meaning of what it meant to have this title, because what we see here is a word that has several meanings embedded. The one meaning is being a master, in other words, being skillful, having a special equipment to be able to earn this title. And the other meaning that's hidden in this word, acheti, is the name of Thoth, because one of the words for Thoth was the Techi, the architect, and that word is also hiding in this title of being a master. Here is the first person in the third dynasty, which is when the Old Kingdom begins, that probably carried the Mehit title. His name was Nefer Seshemra, and he was buried at Saqqara near the step pyramid of Djoser. Another individual who was probably also alive at the time of Djoser was a person by the name of Hesi-Ra, and on this wooden panel that comes from his tomb, also from Saqqara, you can see again the lioness Mehit with the jaw sign above. Another master of Mehit was Hemiunu, who served under Khufu, and he may have been the architect of the Great Pyramid. This is the pedestal of the famous statue that was made of him, and it was found in his tomb G4000 in the West Field next to the Great Pyramid. And there again you see the title with the Mehit sign, with the jaw sign, and this now is part of a tandem title which also the other individuals carried that I just introduced you to. And this special dual title was only given to the highest official at the court of the king. And here is a close-up of the same image showing the jaw sign over the lioness. And I want to point something out here that was noticed by Robert Schoch a couple of years ago. He noticed that this inscription is next to the foot of Hemiunu, and that is an interesting clue that there was some kind of relationship between these symbols and being next to or under the foot of a statue. And here is the stunning stone plate from the tomb of J.A.W. And what you can see here again is the Mehit sign with the jaw sign above, and this is part of the tandem title at the top of this column, and the rest of this column, which I indicated in my talk, has to do not only with scribing but also with archiving. And in fact there is a library mentioned at the bottom of this column. This is a close-up of the same symbols from the stone plate of J.A.W, and what you can see here is the fine, exquisite detail with which these symbols were carved and painted on that stone plate. And here is, from what is currently known, the final carrier of the Mehit title. His name was Mary. He lived in the 4th dynasty, probably under Khafre. Not only that, he probably was the person that was supervising the conversion of the lioness statue Mehit into the Great Sphinx. And the proof of that has to do in part with another title that is here on the left side. And from that title, as I was showing you in my main talk, come the two names of the Great Sphinx in the New Kingdom. So it really begins with Mary, that the names of Horem Achet and Horachti were created, and the very beginning of this name creation, I think, is right here on this inscription from Mary. But there's another clue that I want to show you. Remember, Robert Schoch noticed something very interesting about the fact that the dual title was next to the left foot of Hemiunu. Well, there's something that you might miss if you just casually look at the inscriptions, but they're very subtle, and there's interesting clues that can tip you off, and that kind of makes you wonder if there was a secret that was not supposed to be made public, but nevertheless the information was still there, only in a codified form, in an artistic way still displayed. but not for anyone and everyone to realize. And so this is what I wanted to show you now. If you look carefully at how the symbols are arranged here, you see the lioness over here. Here are the four paws. But what do we have right next to that? We have the sign of an arm, and under the arm we have this sign, which is the sign for a papyrus scroll. And so here now we're beginning to get yet another taste of this idea that there was in fact an archive under Mehit, under the statue of Mehit, who later became the Great Sphinx. When many of you hear the word Hall of Records, you might think of this man, Edgar Cayce. Well, who was Edgar Cayce? Edgar Cayce was a psychic. He lived in the early part of the 20th century. He was born actually in the 19th century. And he became active in the 1920s and 30s, and he began to have readings, give readings to patients, to people that wanted advice for life. And then there were people that had questions that had to do with the history of the world and specifically Egypt and how it related to their lives, what might be found under the Sphinx, and including the Hall of Records. So Edgar Cayce had a very religious upbringing. He was a very moral man. He did not want to corrupt himself and sell his readings. He wanted to give this sort of as a service to people. And so when you read the history of his life, you're kind of really taken by this deep, profound, caring, and moral character of this man. And so I think it's really stunning how he was able to tap into this part of his subconscious and pull out this type of information. So he ended up predicting something that he thought was under the Sphinx. And what was that? Well, he thought that from Atlantis, information, knowledge arrived in Egypt, and that information was stored in a sealed chamber somewhere in Giza, and the access to this chamber, he called it the Tomb of Records, the Room of Records, and even inside the Pyramid of Records, this place could be accessed from under the Great Sphinx. So he thought that this place was sealed and it would not be unsealed until humanity would be ready for it. And so when Edgar Cayce was alive in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, he thought that this chamber still was sealed, it had not been breached, and it would be opened sometime in his century. I think it is important, though, to set the record straight and clarify that Edgar Cayce is not the first person to talk about the Hall of Records. In fact, you can go as far back as to the ancient Egyptians themselves, some 3,000 years before Edgar Cayce, and you can find inscriptions, specifically this one here, that is very explicitly mentioning a Hall of Records. Not only that, that Hall of Records is under the Great Sphinx. So let me read this for you. A will hath been done into writing by the Lord of Chemenu, which is Thoth, the scribe of the library of Ra Hamarkis, in the hall of the divine house or temple of Anu, which is Heliopolis, established, perfected, and made permanent in hieroglyphs under the feet of Ra Hamarkis, and he shall transmit it to the son of his son forever and ever. Well, but who is Ra Hamarkis? It turns out Ra Hamarkis is really the Greek version of Horem Achet, and Horem Achet is the Great Sphinx. And so here we have an inscription that is dated to the New Kingdom, something like 1200 to 1400 BC, and the papyrus here is called the Magical Papyrus of Harris. Harris, the person being who purchased the papyrus in one of the antiquity markets in Egypt, and then it ended up at the British Museum where you can still see it today. And from this inscription, I think it should be very clear at this point that this idea of a Hall of Records did not originate with Edgar Cayce. No, it is possible that Edgar Cayce was channeling the idea, and who knows how he was able to tap into this information, and I have no idea how he could have done this. But all I want to clarify is that the record of the Hall of Records, the written record that is, dates to ancient Egypt, and it comes from the ancient Egyptians themselves. Here are two early dynastic sealings that show Mehit with the jaw sign. In this upper ceiling here, there's the Great Hall. This is a typical arrangement that can be seen on several of the ceilings that come from this time. But in this particular version, there's something very interesting here that you can see under this Great Hall, and it's a square structure. And I can tell you that in these types of inscriptions, that usually designates an underground chamber. So this is not just something that's above ground or a building or a facility. No, this is something underground, and this would be a cellar. And in fact, here you can see a corridor, a ramp, a staircase, or something like that that leads into this particular chamber. And as you can see, this is intimately associated with Mehit and with this great hall. And then here in this other example, this is very rare. There's, to my knowledge, no other example of this where now the jaw signs above Mehit have been replaced with this sign. And according to Petrie, and I agree with him, this shows a satchel, so to speak, that contains several papyrus scrolls. So this would have been something that you use to store papyrus scrolls. And so you have, in essence here, a symbol that designates, or denotes rather, an archive. And that archive is immediately associated with the statue of Mehit. And now I want to come back one more time to the stone plate of Rep-M-Nofret and show you the sequence of the two titles, because now that we have a hint that the Mehit title with the jaw sign have something to do with an archive, now let's see if we can find more clues that tell us that there was in fact a real chamber, a real Hall of Records under Mehit. And so in order to prove this, the identity of this object is key, to use a pun, and that's why this became such an important part of my investigation. And this investigation really revolved not only around the identity of the object, but of course also where this lioness was located. Here I want to show you a few seals. These were used to close jars and pots and bags, and then they were imprinted with seals that showed, in the case of shipments to the royal tombs, with the Mehit sign and the jaw sign above. And here's an example of such a seal. This comes from the first dynasty, from the third king by the name of J.A.W. Here's a photo of a ceiling where you can see the bent rods, and the lioness is not so well visible on this image, but it would be immediately underneath. And here you can see the Great Hall, the animal shrine. Here's a little easier way to see this. So here's the animal shrine. There's Mehit with the triple rods. This particular ceiling was very important because it helped us to locate this facility and the lioness to Giza. And so this is what I'm going to show you now in the next slide. So one possible way that you could have identified this building that appears to have an animal sitting on top of it is a jackal that is sitting on a pedestal. And the reason why this would be a reasonable choice is because that actually is a hieroglyph that means he who is over the secrets. And if this is a scribal facility, it's an archive of the king, then that would make sense. But it turns out that this actually means something else, which I'm going to mention in a few moments. So first of all, I want to show you the other symbols on the ceiling. Here is the sign for east, and that of course makes sense because the Great Sphinx, as you probably know, is facing due east, and in this case, again, the lioness is facing that same direction. Here, this sign designates northern Egypt, that's the delta area, and so that also made sense for Mehit to be located in that part of Egypt. The other symbols here spell out something like Mehit, and I think the reason why this is probably the name of Mehit is because this particular sign here, which is pronounced Hem, was being used because there was no sign at the time to spell the opposite sequence of those two letters, in other words, Me. And so that's why the scribe were using this particular symbol, but I think ultimately what this was supposed to say was Mehit. Now, if we look at the animal shrine here, and specifically what this is called by the ancient Egyptians, we know from the third dynasty that this was called Per-Wer or Per-Ur, either way, which means the Great Hall. The Great Hall, as far as we know, was originally located in southern Egypt, in Upper Egypt. And what I think is going on, why this is appearing on the ceiling with Mehit, even though this appears to be in Lower Egypt, in the north of Egypt, and at Giza specifically, I think is that this is a symbol of, only a symbol of the administration. And so in the early kingdom, the king had satellite offices, and this is kind of a satellite administrative building that was made in the image of the main headquarters, so to speak, if you will, in southern Egypt, and that's why it has that same shape. And that same shape, the animal that you see here was probably an elephant. And the last symbol, the one that was behind the animal shrine, that symbol stands for the sound stau. But what is stau? Well, that's really the name for Giza, which was Rostau. And so stau, which means caves, relates to Rostau because R in front of stau means the gate or the opening to the cave. So Rostau was the name, the ancient name for Giza, and really what it meant was that it was the gateway to the caves. And here I want to show you that the bent rod sign was not just some abstract symbol, and the clue of this is that there were actually other objects from the same time, as you can see here, that were in the shape of a bent rod. Now, I'm not saying that the bent rod, the jaw sign, is depicting this object that you see here. No, what I'm saying is that this proves that there were real objects that had that shape that were used for something, in this particular case, probably a curtain hanger in ancient Egypt. Here is another object related to the idea of a key that could also be depicted by the jaw sign. This comes from a reconstruction by Ludwig Borchardt, who discovered a granite door in the valley temple of the 5th dynasty king Sahura. And based on what he was able to recover, specifically the sockets that were drilled into the door frame, he proposed that this was originally used as a door handle to secure a door. And as you can see, this device in Borchardt's reconstruction resembles the jaw sign. And here now are a few ancient keys, and I did not know about ancient keys and ancient locks when I had this idea that the jaw sign may be a key. But then after the fact, when I began to research it, I realized, yes, it is possible that this could in fact be a key because these keys, these ancient keys, had sort of the same appearance as the jaw sign. Here's the map of ancient Egypt, and I want you to get oriented in terms of what I'm going to tell you in a few moments. So this here is what was called the Delta, the northern area, northern Egypt, or also called Lower Egypt. And all of this is the so-called Nile Valley, and this would all be considered Upper Egypt. And you can think of this as two separate language zones in prehistoric times. So before Narmer conquered the north, the Delta area, this was really two completely separate cultures, two completely separate people that had different economies and, most importantly, spoke different languages and used two different ways to write. And to put some names on these two language zones, here is the South Upper Egypt and the particular metropolitan areas where most people lived in those early pre-dynastic times, in prehistory, so to speak, were Thinis, Nagada, and Hierakonpolis, Nechen. So this, you can think of one language zone, one conglomeration of people, and it is this area from which Narmer came. And then you have this other area here in the north. This is Lower Egypt in the Delta, as I just mentioned, and the capital, if you will, the major metropolitan center in this area here was called Buto. And here's a timeline to orient you not just in space but also along the time axis. So here we have 2,000 years that I haven't put in here. That is to come to our modern time. And all of this, these 3,000 years, is Egyptian history. And this here, for example, would be the time of Jesus. The time of Muhammad would be here. This is the time of Moses. And some people think that this may have happened even earlier. So the Exodus may be in the Middle Kingdom. Here is the time of the Great Sphinx, the time of Khafre, the Old Kingdom. And it is here in approximately 3000, maybe 3100 BC, is when Narmer was alive. And Narmer is the king, the first king of Egypt, who unified the two lands, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And so here is a good way for me to illustrate the language problem, and that will help us in a few moments to understand what the original meaning of the jaw sign was. So here is the famous Narmer palette. This is a triumphant scene that shows the first king of Egypt smiting his enemies, and presumably these people were the people from the north, the delta of Egypt, and this is basically the conquest scene. It shows the first king of Egypt conquering the north, and in that way establishing for the first time the country or the state, the nation of Egypt. But what's relevant here in terms of this intensive is something that you see up here, and that is how the name of Narmer was spelled on this triumphant plate. And what you can see is that the name was spelled with two symbols, the symbol of a catfish and the symbol of a chisel. But there is something really strange that's going on with the way that Narmer is spelled here, because these two symbols, catfish and chisel, when you translate them into the language of Upper Egypt, southern Egypt, that is, from where Narmer came, you come up with a really strange translation. Basically, it's a bad, disrespectful way to refer to a king. Basically meant bad catfish. So how could this be? Well, this was something that was pointed out first by a German Egyptologist by the name of Wolfgang Helg years ago, and he said, this can't be right. What this means is that these two symbols came from another language zone. They must have come from the north, and the northerners were basically writing the name of Narmer in the only way that they knew. But in their language, those two symbols certainly did not mean something bad. They meant what you see in the symbol. In the northern language zone around Bhutto, the symbols, according to what Helg put together, actually mean what they show. So in terms of this particular example, a catfish symbol in the north actually meant catfish, and a chisel sign meant chisel. But this is not how these two symbols were being used in this particular example. Because it turns out, and this is something that I put together just recently, is that I think what's going on here is that the sound of these two symbols is what was being used, not the actual meaning of what is being shown. So we're not talking about catfish and chisel, which for the Upper Egyptians would have meant something bad, like sick or bad catfish. No. There were two words, most likely in Upper Egypt, that sounded similar to the pronunciation of the words in Lower Egypt. So let me explain. The sound of the word for catfish in northern Egypt must have been something like nar, and the sound for chisel, again in the language of northern Egypt, must have been something like mer. And why were these two symbols used? Well, that's because there were two words in the language of southern Egypt that meant something completely different. Neru, which sounded kind of like nar, and what Neru means is a bull. And mer sounded kind of like the word Mary, which in the language of Upper Egypt meant the feared one. So now we have a completely different meaning. Feared fighting bull. This is what I think was the name, the original name of Narmer, or the meaning of his name. But that was the meaning of the name in southern Egypt. In order to spell this name phonetically, the sound of those words basically, the northern Egyptians had to use symbols that had a sound that was similar to those two words, and so they ended up using the catfish and the chisel sign, not because they were trying to say that Narmer is a bad catfish, okay? No, they wanted to use those two symbols phonetically, so that the lower Egyptians would immediately, the southern Egyptians would immediately recognize what is being meant here, which is the name of Narmer, and that name meant the feared fighting bull. So now that I have explained this language issue, I can now explain what I think the jaw sign really truly meant. And for that, I'm going to take you to these inscriptions. These were marks on pots and jars that were found by Flinders Petrie in the royal tombs. And here we do see the jaw sign being used, but not with the lioness in this case, but with this other symbol. Now it turns out that this other symbol actually is a hieroglyph that was used in Upper Egypt. And there it meant something like an oil tribute, a tax, something that was being collected from the conquered zone and that had to be shipped to the south as a payment, a tribute. And the particular sound of that word, oil tribute, for this particular sign was Ga. Now, I thought to myself, if this has to do with oil, and we're looking at a shipment of precious goods from the north to the south, then this other sign, which I was trying to discover what it meant, perhaps was the location where this oil came from. Well, when you look in prehistoric times and dynastic times to see where oil was being made in Egypt, it was made in the delta in a city called Bubastis. That's the Greek name. But the ancient Egyptian name for that place was Ba-Set. Ba-Set. Ba means the soul, and Set means the place. So you can think of it sort of as the soul of the place or the place of the soul. But here's the key. Another name, another word for Set, place, was the word Bu. And so I thought, if this symbol in a similar way that I just explained to you regarding the name of Narmer, if this symbol was being used here phonetically to refer to Bubastis, to the city of Basset, where the oil that's being shown here, the symbol of which is being shown here, came from, then this symbol may have sounded something like Babu, Basset, Babu. And of course, this is a long shot. I was trying as best as I could to come up with a translation for this. And so I thought, well, let's investigate this and see where it takes me. Well, it turns out this ended up becoming a major discovery. So again, just to orient you, if you look at the delta here, the city of Basset, Bubastis in Greek, was in this location here. And if you remember, Buto was just a little bit to the north and west of that. And the question is, how can we find out the original meaning of the word Babu that may have been depicted by this Ven symbol? Well, it turns out that some historians think that the people that lived here in the Delta may have had some contact with people in Sumer at the time. And this is understandable because there is evidence that this was a very active trading hub. The people that lived here were basically trading in all kinds of goods from this whole area, and they were basically shipping those goods down to the mother country down in the south. And so some people have proposed that perhaps these people here, the Butumadi, the script and language of these people may be possibly related to the script and language of the Sumerians. And so what I did is, and this is part of the long shot experiment, is to look at the words, the dictionary, the Sumerian dictionary that is, to see if there is such a word in the Sumerian language that might help me to translate the jaw sign. And so what I did is to look at the Akkadian dictionary, which is published by the University of Chicago, and you have access to this yourself. This is publicly available. And I was looking for a word like Babu or Buba to help me translate it. And here's what I found. And again, this is a great surprise. I had no idea that this was going to be what I was going to discover, but it just goes to show sometimes when you have even a long shot idea and you just have a very low chance of success, it does not mean you should discourage yourself and not pursue the idea, because sometimes you can make a major discovery, and I think this is what happened here. So if you look at, first of all, the words Ga Babu, which if you remember, the one symbol, the winged disc symbol, stood for Ga, and the jaw sign in my reconstruction may have meant or sounded like Babu. And when you look at that combination, Ga Babu, there is in fact a word for that in the Akkadian dictionary from Sumerian and Akkadian, and what it means is unbelievably to bend, which is of course immediately reminds you of the shape of the bent rod. So that was exciting. But the real surprise came when I looked at the word Babu, because what Babu meant in Sumerian is actually opening, doorway, door, or gate. And so here I had an amazing confirmation that this symbol in its original meaning meant something like an opener or a door. And of course, that is exactly the type of thing that I had suspected, that we're looking at a key or a door opener, and that really was a device to enter the real Hall of Records. And it is always good, it's always a good idea to be able to double stitch your proof. And if there's any doubt that I may have just by accident found something that's not related, those doubts were blown away by Pyramid Text 684, because there we see an inscription that has to do with the winding waterway, the Mer Nai Cha. And in front of this winding waterway, we see this word Rabu. Now, Rabu is an Egyptian word in this context, And what it means is exactly winding, bending, curving, and that is exactly like the word Ga-Babu, which is what I reconstructed. These two symbols mean Ga and Babu. So I had a nice confirmation here that yes, there was in fact an Egyptian word that sounded very much like Ga-Babu, which in my reconstruction comes from the northern part of Egypt and ultimately has meaning also in the Sumerian language. Now, I want to go back to something that Edgar Cayce said when he made his prophecies about the Hall of Records. If you remember, Edgar Cayce thought that this archive was still sealed, and it would not be unsealed until mankind would be ready to open the archive. But here is an inscription from 5,000 years ago. Again, this is from the time of the first dynasty, from Horus J.A.W, the tomb of Horus J.A.W, that is. And what you're looking at here is a tag that was once attached to a shipment. So this is, again, a shipping label. And on these shipping labels, many times, a year-defining event was recorded. In this case, these three symbols record this particular event. And this was a big deal because, as you can see, there's not much room on these tags. So in order to define the year in which this particular shipment was made, the ancient Egyptians used a specific event that everybody would recognize and remember, and then they would say, ah, okay, that it was that particular year when so and so happened. And in this particular case, what happened is up set of det, and what that means is open place of an archive. And so here I find something that contradicts the idea that the archive was sealed. Now you might ask, well, how do you know that this word of det for archive refers to the archive under the Sphinx, the Hall of Records? And the answer to that is that this particular word is not just the word for any archive. No, this word of det, we learn how important it is in ancient Egyptian mythology because it's mentioned several times in the coffin text and specifically in the Book of Two Ways. And there, in the coffin text, this particular archive is the archive from which the sun god created the world. In other words, there's information and records inside of this archive that were instrumental in creating the entire world. And so this is not just any archive. If we're looking for a hall of records that had special information, lost knowledge, that was so important that entire civilization could have been seeded with that knowledge, then this is exactly the kind of archive that we have to be looking for. But the Ofdet is not just a mythical archive. In fact, this is a word that was used for a real archive. So when we look at this stone plate here, this is a beautiful inscription that is dated to the very beginning of the fourth dynasty. So this was an official J.A.W that was serving under Sneferu, the first king of the fourth dynasty. And on his stela, we see this particular title here, and this is a scribal title. You can recognize that from this particular sign here, and this is the royal sign. And what this title means is the Sheret Aw of Det. What does that mean? Well, it means under the arm archive. So it is an archive, a royal archive, and J.A.W was a scribe in this archive, and we have a literal designation here for this archive that tells us that it was under the arm. And here is the particular sign, and if you remember, this is exactly the same sign as we see in the oil tag, which is a archive that was open in the first dynasty. And here again, we now see it in a real physical context, not in a mythical context. And in any case, I think there was really no artificial separation between these two things, because if this archive is mentioned in a real context, physical context, and it's mentioned in a mythical context, then we really can fuse these two things together in this case. And so here we now have a real physical archive and of det, and we have a reference that this was under the arm. And so the additional information that we're gleaning from this inscription is that the Sheret of dead of the king, the Nesu, is under the arm. So the name of the archive is the Under the Arm Archive, and Netaryapev was the scribe that served in this archive. Now I want to take you back to a reading from Edgar Cayce. This is from 1937. And here in this reading, he's referring to the entity that established this archive. And so what we read here is, hence we find the entity then, Axten Tena, as will be said in the present, was the first to set the records that are yet to be discovered or yet to be had of those activities in the Atlantean land, and for the preservation of the data that is yet to be found from the chambers of the way between the Sphinx and the Pyramid of Records. And after that, he says, hence is it a wonder in the present that the entity is in this experience under the symbol and the sign of both the Sphinx and the Pyramid, when there is to be given a new awakening in many portions of the earth. So what we have here is an interesting clue from Edgar Cayce himself, that there is something under the symbol and the sign that refers to this Atlantean archive. But that is, of course, what we find here on the inscription of Mary, because if you remember, there's this interesting clue that there is something under the forepaw of the sign of the Sphinx. And in this case, of course, it's the sign of Mehit, the lioness statue that preceded the Great Sphinx. And it couldn't be, even though this is cryptic and you would easily brush over this and not see it, but when you really know what you're looking for, it couldn't be clearer, because you have the arm sign, and under the arm you have the sign, the symbol of the papyrus scroll. And so I think this is yet another clue that what we're dealing with here with the Afded and the Sheret, meaning the under the arm, we're really talking about the same entity. And all of these clues are taking us to Giza, they're taking us to the Great Sphinx, and they're particularly taking us to a place under the forepaw of the Great Sphinx. And that, of course, is what Edgar Cayce predicted, that the archive, the entry to the archive, would be located under the right paw of the Great Sphinx. And what I'm finding here in terms of the inscriptions from the ancient Egyptians themselves is that most of this prediction by Edgar Cayce seems to be correct, even though he's not the first one who came up with the Hall of Records and the location under the feet, because remember, this was an inscription from the ancient Egyptians. But there is some correspondence between the two narratives. The main difference that I see, however, is that this archive, the real archive that I am tracing here with the inscriptions from the ancient Egyptians, was breached. It was unsealed a long time ago, which is in contrast to what Edgar Cayce predicted, that that chamber, that hall of records, that room of records would be opened after his lifetime, and particularly in terms of what Edgar Cayce predicted, that would be happening around the turn of the 21st century. But I think the other evidence that I have, which is something that may have been inside this archive, actually suggests rather that that archive was indeed breached a long time ago, and what was inside ended up leaking into the culture of the ancient Egyptians. And that is why eventually Egyptologists and archaeologists would be able to unearth it. And one such item that I think was inside of this archive ends up being the painting, which I describe in my book Under the Sphinx. The painting is called the Vignette of Ra, and in the Vignette of Ra we see something very strange. It is a unique painting, not seen again in all of Egyptian history. And what I show in the book is that this painting is really a depiction of the heliocentric solar system. In other words, the sun in the center and the 9 planets around. But that is an idea that the ancient Egyptians did not know about. They thought that the earth is in the center and everything, including the sky, was turning around the Earth. And so to them, this would have been unusual information that they couldn't have possibly known. And so to me, what that means is that we are probably dealing here with information that they inherited, and there is really only one place from where it could have come, and that is the archive under the Sphinx. Well, and so that was the intensive. Thank you for your attendance. I would like to thank Contact in the Desert, the organizers, for inviting me to be able to share my discoveries with you. And now I hope there's enough time that you can ask questions. And this part of the presentation is going to be live, and we can have a discussion. And I hope you ask me some questions, because I know I open a can of worms, and something like that will not go without many questions. So please feel free to ask me anything you like. Even if you feel like this is not a good question, go ahead and ask, because those kind of questions are usually the best ones. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon.